Hey everyone, I finally made it to the last book in the SFML series. This is actually the fifth one so far. The previous books were SFML Essentials, SFML Blueprints, SFML Game Development, and SFML Game Development by Example. And honestly, all of them were pretty bad, sometimes completely unbearable, and on top of that, outdated. But this book is different. It was written in 2024. It uses the C++20 standard, although the SFML version is still SFML2 instead of SFML3, so technically it's already a little outdated too. But honestly, the most important thing is whether the book is actually interesting and reasonably easy to follow. The name of the book is Beginning C++ Game Programming, 3rd edition by John Horde. One thing I should mention right away is that this book isn't really focused on teaching SFML itself. Its main goal is to teach you C++ while using SFML along the way, which honestly sounds a little weird because to use SFML properly, you already need to know quite a lot about C++. And right now, I'm still not convinced the author can really pull that off. But one thing I'm already grateful for is the code formatting. Unlike the previous books, the code here doesn't look like a pile of random symbols smashed together by a drunk programmer. And I should also mention that this is the biggest SFML book out of all 5. It's 649 pages long. So I'm going to judge it from 2 different angles at the same time: how well it teaches C++ and how well it teaches SFML. Chapter 1. Welcome to Beginning C++ Game Programming 3rd edition. And this chapter is actually pretty interesting. First of all, the author explains how to install SFML better than any of the previous books did. And not just SFML, but Visual Studio too. First, he talks about why C++ is awesome. Then comes the praise for SFML and Visual Studio. And after that, you get a really solid step-by-step guide on creating a project, downloading the library, and linking everything together with tons of screenshots along the way. And the best part is no extra tools like CMake. So I have to give the author a lot of credit for that. Next, the author explains that throughout the book, we're going to make 4 different games. First, there is a game where you play as a lumberjack, chopping down a tree, dodging branches, and trying to score points. Then there's Pong, where you control a paddle and bounce a ball around. After that comes a top-down zombie shooter, and finally, a 2D platformer. The author immediately shows what all these games are going to look like, and honestly, that's a really smart way to motivate the reader. After setting everything up and creating the first project, the author immediately starts explaining how our game is going to work. He goes over the mechanics and shows all the images and assets we'll be using. So right away the reader understands what the final product is supposed to look like and what it's made of. That's really great, and it's something the previous books were seriously missing. But once we get into the code itself, the problems start showing up. First though, I'll praise the author again. The code formatting here is way better than in the previous books. Well, obviously there is like a 10-year gap between them. The font is pleasant to read, properly colored, and nicely aligned. Although my digital version of the book has a pretty serious issue. In almost every code example, the code is incomplete. So I had to download the Russian translation of the book alongside it, because that version actually includes the full code examples. Basically, I had to compare 2 books at the same time. Maybe the printed version doesn't have this problem. Now back to the teaching itself. How are you supposed to fully teach C++ from scratch and SFML from scratch at the same time in only 600 pages? In my opinion, you can't. So what I'm seeing here is more of a learn by jumping straight into battle approach. The author immediately shows the code needed to create an empty window and starts explaining it. For example, right away we're using class objects, header files, loops, variables, constructor calls, and a bunch of other things that realistically a beginner shouldn't even know about, or you shouldn't even know yet. And honestly, I think that's a bad approach. The author later tries to fix this a bit by saying that we'll keep coming back to these concepts throughout the book and eventually we're supposed to understand them all. But overwhelming beginners right from the start is just not my style. And I personally don't like teaching that way. So I made the following decision. I'm not going to judge the C++ teaching in this book. If you actually want to learn C++, watch my lessons or read books that are specifically focused on the language itself. From this point on, I'm only going to judge how well the book teaches SFML. So let's imagine that I'm already an experienced C++ developer. I understand the language, and now I just want to learn SFML. Here, the author gives a surface-level explanation of things like screen resolution, how the coordinate system works in SFML, what SF video mode is, what a basic game loop looks like, what textures and sprites are, how to attach a sprite to a texture, and how to draw that sprite on the screen. By the end of the chapter, all we really have is a static game background, but it's still the first step. And honestly, everything related to SFML was crystal clear to me. Variables, operators, and decisions. Animating sprites. Now let's talk about the C++ side of things. In this chapter, you're supposed to learn about variables, constants, comments, arithmetic and logical operators, and the if-else statement. The first problem is that the author mixes up the concepts of definition and declaration. More specifically, everywhere there should technically be a definition, he calls it a declaration instead. Another issue is that there are basically no examples outside the context of the game itself that would help explain these concepts more clearly. And honestly, I get a feeling this is going to be a problem throughout the entire book. In books that focus purely on teaching C++, chapters about variables usually contain at least several standalone examples that properly demonstrate how they work. Here, that's missing completely. You are also supposed to learn how to generate random numbers using srand, rand, and time functions. And honestly, this part is explained really badly and way too quickly. The author never mentions that this is actually an old and outdated way of generating random numbers, which probably means he's going to keep using it throughout the whole book. When the explanation gets to the if statement, the author gives this huge verbal example about pirates defending a ship. For little kids, maybe that sounds like a fun story, but for adults, the problem is that besides that story, there are basically no practical real-world examples of how if statements are actually used. Now, as for the SFML side of the chapter, here we add 3 moving clouds and a single bee to the game. They constantly move across the screen from left to right at random speeds. The code itself is extremely easy to understand, although the author is clearly limited by the fact that he assumes the readers know absolutely nothing about C++. Because of that, he's forced to write every beginner level code. But honestly, for now, I'm okay with that because we're constantly building something in the code and actually seeing progress in the game. Chapter 3. C++ strings, SFML time, player input, and HUD. In this chapter, we add several new things to the first game. A pause state that the game starts in, a progress bar that visually shows how much time is left, a score counter for the player, and a message that appears once the timer runs out. So on the C++ side, the new topics here are std_string and std_string_stream. But honestly, they're explained incredibly poorly and way too superficially. We're talking just a few paragraphs, and that's it. Also, out of nowhere, cout and endline suddenly appear without any explanation at all. I guess the reader is just supposed to magically figure out what they do. One thing I do want to praise the author for, though, is that he constantly shows exactly where new pieces of code should be inserted. That's a really important detail that was completely missing from the previous 4 books. And honestly, now I understand why this book ended up being so huge. On the SFML side, we work with the SFText, SFFont, and SFClock classes. But again, the explanations are mostly limited to something like this class is used for this purpose. And then we immediately jump into using it inside the game code, followed by an explanation of what's happening afterward. Still, despite that, I'd say the author explains the SFML parts reasonably well. Chapter 4. Loops, arrays, switch, enumerations, and functions, implementing game mechanics. Here we are basically cleaning up the code we've written so far. To do that, we first learn about while and for loops. The author gives a huge number of examples for while loops, but for for loops, there's only a single example. The break keyword also gets explained, but continues never mentioned at all. After that, we go over one-dimensional arrays at a pretty decent level. Then the author explains the switch statement, but without ever properly explaining why you would choose it over a regular if statement. Next comes a quick introduction to class enumerations. In other words, instead of first teaching normal enums, the author jumps straight into enum class. But he never talks about assigning explicit values to enumerators, how the values increase internally, or how to change the underlying type. And then something really weird happens with functions. The author starts putting the word public in front of them, even though in C++ that's literally a compilation error. You can do that in C#, but not in C++. Still, functions get the biggest amount of coverage in the chapter. The author explains parameters, naming, return types, function bodies, and return keyword and function calls. He also tries to explain how the stack works and what scope is. But honestly, it's still not enough because there are barely any real examples. He already explained arrays earlier, but never showed how to pass arrays into functions. So once again, the entire C++ part feels like a super quick surface level speedrun whose only purpose is getting us back to SFML as fast as possible. As for the SFML part, there is not really anything new here. We write a single function that gets called from main, and then we add code that draws moving branches onto our tree. And this is actually the first time I can confidently say that the author's code feels weird. For example, why is he generating random numbers from 0 to 5 if he only checks whether the result equals 1, 0, or 2? Or why does he keep calling srand function inside the game's update loop instead of calling it once in the beginning? I couldn't find any answers to that. So overall, this chapter feels very simple and honestly not very interesting. Chapter 5. Collisions, sound, and end conditions, making the game playable. Here we finally finish working on our first game, and once again the author immediately shows the final result, which I really like because the reader clearly understands what they're working toward. There's nothing especially complicated here. We just add a few new features to the game. The player can now die from branches, the tree gets caught visually, and the player changes position together with the axe. From the C++ side, you won't really learn anything new in this chapter, but the author does add sound effects to the game, so here you'll work with the SF sound buffer and SF sound classes, and also use the play method. At the end, the author gives a few suggestions on how the game could be improved further, and honestly, I think this is the first time across all 5 books that someone actually encourages the reader to do additional work on their own. And I genuinely recommend doing those exercises because they're not difficult and they're directly based on the material the author already showed. Now, yes, the code for this first game looks terrible in terms of architecture. There's basically no real structure at all, but honestly, that's actually fine for now because the author is focused on showing us SFML tools and immediately demonstrating them in practice. If over time he starts improving the code quality and architecture, then I won't really have any complaints about this approach. But I still think the book would have been much better if the author had completely removed the C++ teaching and focused entirely on SFML instead. Chapter 6. Object-Oriented Programming, starting the Pong game. In this chapter, we finally move on to classes and object-oriented programming. First, the author explains OOP purely in theory, along with the 3 main OOP principles: encapsulation, inheritance, and polymorphism. The problem is that he basically treats encapsulation as nothing more than hiding data and functions behind the private access modifier. And honestly, I don't agree with that. To me, encapsulation is the ability to combine data and behavior into a single entity and protect it from incorrect external use. I also just noticed that the author writes increment and decrement operators with spaces instead of attaching them directly to variables, and honestly, it looks really weird. Now, teaching OOP at that stage is way too early, but the author is basically a speedrunner. He's always rushing forward, so I'm not surprised anymore. In this chapter, you suddenly run into classes, objects, fields, methods, constructors, and even start splitting the game into multiple files. We now have header files and source files as well. That's a pretty huge step for a programmer, just definitely not at this stage. As for the SFML side of things, there is basically nothing new here. We've started working on a new game, and honestly, right now it looks way worse than the first one. The author never explains what features we're eventually going to add throughout the book, and he also doesn't show the final result this time. Maybe even he's embarrassed by how awkward this game looks. Anyway, in this chapter, we create our first class called Bat, which moves left and right when you press keys, and we also display the player's lives and score on the screen. Chapter 7, AABB, Collision Detection and Physics, finishing the Pong game. I finally figure out what the second game actually is. You just keep bouncing a ball, or technically a square, with a paddle until you get bored. When the square touches the top edge of the window, you get points. When it falls below the paddle, you lose a life. Lose all 3 lives and the game restarts. Honestly, that sounds unbelievably boring. The author really could have come up with something more interesting. Anyway, we create ball class, which is basically just a square, and add it into our game loop. The main thing you learn here is the AABB collision detection method, axis aligned bounding box collision. It's not complicated at all. This is also the first time we see the intersects method, which the author uses without ever properly explaining separately. And just to completely finish us off, the author suddenly decides to talk about the spaceship operator, even though he never actually uses it anywhere in the game. And the explanation itself is terrible too. Why is this information even here? No answer is given. At the end of every chapter, including this one, there is also a little Q&A section with possible reader questions. And honestly, some of them are actually useful, like why is the game running too slowly, or why is there no sound in the game? Chapter 8, SFML Views, Studying the Zombie Shooter Game. Here we begin working on our third game, a top-down zombie shooter. This time the author actually shows the final version of the game and explains all the features we're eventually going to implement, which is great. This already feels like a much bigger and more serious project than the previous 2 games combined. The increase in scale and is very noticeable. I also want to point out that every time a new game starts, the author creates a completely new Visual Studio project and once again fully explains how to connect SFML to it. Honestly, it probably would have been better to just reference the specific section from the first chapter instead of repeating the whole setup process every single time. But by the end of this chapter, all we have is a player standing in the center of a black screen rotating to face whether you move the mouse cursor. Here the author is at least trying to build some kind of architecture, but the code still looks pretty bad. The author makes some really beginner level mistakes. For example, he calls a method stores the returned value in a variable, and then literally one line later calls the exact same method again just to pass that same value into another function instead of simply using the variable he already created. So the method gets called twice for absolutely no reason. Some variable and function names also feel pretty questionable, and parts of the code are duplicated way too much. It was also kind of funny reading the explanation of static functions. Basically, the author describes static functions in like 2 sentences, and that's it. He calls a static function, briefly says what it is, and immediately moves on. But he never explains why static functions exist or any of the important details behind them. The main topic here is the explanation of what a camera is in SFML, or more specifically, SF view. but the author never shows any diagrams or screenshots to visually explain how the class actually works. We only get a verbal explanation and a pretty weak example inside the game itself. And honestly, if the book keeps going in this direction, I'm probably going to start disliking it a lot. Chapter 9. C++ references, sprite sheets, and vertex arrays. First, the author starts explaining references, and honestly, he gets it wrong. He says that references are data that store the address of a variable, but that's not really true. A reference is a language-level alias for another variable, although technically compilers can implement references internally as pointers in some situations. Apparently, the author either doesn't know that or just ignores it completely. For example, the examples are also way too simple and don't really communicate the actual purpose of references. Usually, people explain pointers first and references afterward because references are basically a simplified and safer way of working with pointers. But in this book, pointers won't even appear until the next chapter. And honestly, the way references are used here is pretty awkward and kind of messy. Proper code would usually look very different. On the SFML side, though, we finally learn about sprite sheets and texture atlases. And funnily enough, this is actually the first time I learned something new from this book, because none of the previous 4 books ever mentioned texture atlases at all. We have a sprite sheet containing 4 different floor textures, and the author teaches us how to extract those individual pieces and use them to build a 10 by 10 arena through SF vertex array. And this is actually the first time the code reached a medium level of complexity for me. Up until now, the book had been very easy to follow, but honestly, the algorithm used to fill this array feels like something that could have been simplified a lot. Chapter 10. Pointers, the standard template library, and texture management. First, the author explains what a pointer is, and compared to references, there's definitely a lot more information here, but still nowhere near enough. Honestly, I covered way more in my own lesson on pointers. Through pointers, we also get introduced to heap memory. But again, there are basically no useful real-world examples showing why you'd actually want to use it. Next comes a short introduction to the STL. The author gives an incomplete list of containers, and some of the descriptions aren't even fully accurate. We only look at 2 containers, vector and map. And even those are covered very superficially, basically just a simple definition and a quick look at a few methods. And by the way, notice the title of the last section in the chapter, and texture management. Except there's no texture management at all. The entire chapter is basically just C++ explanations, plus the auto keyword thrown in there too. Chapter 11. Coding the TextureHolder class and building a horde of zombies. And the chaos continues here. First of all, the author introduces the single tone pattern. The problem is that it most likely isn't even needed here in the first place. I also noticed that he is using both hashtag pragma once and traditional header guards at the same time. Why do we need double protection when either one alone is already enough? In this chapter, he starts improving the project architecture by creating a class responsible for storing textures. But instead of using a clean enum class as the key for the std map, which he himself talked about earlier, he uses plain strings instead. What really made me laugh was the fact that he implements the single tone pattern while still leaving the constructor public. 10 years passed between this book and the previous SFML books, and yet somehow it feels like the author never even read them. Because honestly, those older books handled architecture way better than this one in almost every way. Then we get to the zombie class, and somehow it stores the stats for all zombie types inside one class instead of representing a single zombie. That's the kind of mistake I'd expect from a C++ student, not from someone teaching the language. What's even weirder is that in the previous chapter, he explained std vector, but here he suddenly switches back to using a raw dynamic array allocated manually on the heap and deleted manually at the end of the game. Did different students write these chapters or something? By the end of the chapter, zombies start spawning from different sides of the map and walking toward the player. And honestly, at this point, the book is starting to feel more and more terrible and low quality. Chapter 12. Collision detection, pickups, and bullets. The code just keeps getting uglier and uglier. The author wants to implement bullets, so he creates a class and writes this weird, inaccurate bullet movement algorithm that's way more complicated than it needs to be, instead of simply using vectors like basically every programmer does. For some reason, he also creates 100 bullets right at the start of the game, even though the player hasn't fired a single shot yet. Then, when he adds a crosshair to the game, he uses a regular sprite instead of using the SF cursor class. The same mess happens with the pickup class. The pickup type is passed into the constructor as a plain number. If it's 1, it's a medkit. If it's literally any other number, it's ammo. Why are we even using raw numbers for this? And why do this class and several others need to know the size of the entire arena? There are way too many dependencies between classes. Also, why are we checking every single frame whether all 100 bullets intersect with all 100 zombies when that many objects don't even exist on screen most of the time? There's absolutely no optimization here whatsoever. By the end of this chapter, though, we finally build interactions between the player, bullets, and zombies. We can kind of kill zombies now and die ourselves too. Chapter 13. Layering, Views, and Implementing the Hood. In this chapter, we add a background screen for the start of the game, a pause menu, and a game over screen. We also add a hood that displays a bunch of text and information on the screen. That's really nothing new here. It's mostly just repeated use of SF text and SF sprite in different places throughout the game. The funny thing is that several chapters ago, the author already explained functions and classes, and yeah, he still keeps writing the majority of the code directly inside the main function, which turns it into complete chaos. Chapter 14. Sound effects, file input-output, and finishing the game. And honestly, the third game ends in a pretty boring way. We just add more sound effects and enemy waves that increase with each level. And that's basically it for the game. Maybe it's actually fun to play, but personally I didn't even want to try it anymore because the code completely killed my interest in it. You'll also learn how to save and load the high score from a file. Of course, none of that is properly explained, but there's still one final project left ahead of us, and it's the biggest one in the book. I'm really curious whether the architecture there is going to be just as terrible, because if it is, then this might be, honestly, the worst SFML book I've seen so far, but we'll see. Chapter 15. Run. Here, we begin working on the final game in the book, a platformer runner. First of all, the author immediately shows the final result of the project, although the explanation itself is incomplete. As a reader, I'd want to clearly understand everything we're going to be able to do in this platformer and also see all the assets and resources we'll be using throughout development, especially since the author actually did that in earlier projects. Second, the platformer honestly looks terrible, but to be fair, all of his games kind of look like garbage. He really could have chosen better sprites and assets. Third, there is basically nothing new here regarding SFML itself, but the author does mention that later on we'll supposedly use shaders. We're also going to implement a parallax effect in the game, and finally, according to him, this project will have a proper architecture. Yeah, we'll see about that. Fourth, on the C++ side, this chapter introduces a lot of topics: inheritance, polymorphism, and smart pointers. But just like always, everything is explained extremely superficially and very briefly. The difference now is that he's actually going to use all these concepts because apparently we now have a professional architecture, except not really. Sure, it's much better than the previous 3 architectures in the book, but it still feels weird in a lot of ways. For example, the naming of the components is strange. Why are components literally called things like update or graphics instead of something more standard like update component or draw component? There's also a section explaining what design patterns are and which patterns we're supposedly going to use in this platformer. But honestly, design patterns are more of a junior plus level topic. You don't just need to understand the theory, you need to first experience the problems that patterns solve by seeing bad examples and using them in practice. Of course, none of that happens here. But the funniest part is that the author tries to implement an entity component system, which is already a pretty advanced concept for beginners. And the thing is, this platformer absolutely does not need ECS at all. The game is way too simple for that. And to make it even better, he doesn't even implement ECS the way modern architectures usually do it. Chapter 16: Sound, Game Logic, Inter-Object Communication, and the Player. Speaking of the architecture, the first thing we do here is write an audio engine, where all music and sound resources are stored as static data. Why? At this point, after going through the previous 4 books, I honestly can't even look at this architecture anymore. Seriously, imagine you're a programmer opening this project for the first time. What exactly are you supposed to think when you see code like class level update inherits from update? Just think about how nonsensical that sounds. Inside this class, some variables are regular member fields, while others are pointer fields that immediately allocate memory manually on the heap using the new operator, even though the author literally explained smart pointers in the previous chapter. So why isn't he using them here? I don't know. And you know what? This is the exact point where I finally gave up. I stopped here and decided not to continue reading the book anymore. Why? Because I've already read 4 other SFML books before this one, and honestly, they're better in almost every way. If you want to learn C++, then go look for books that are actually focused on teaching C++. This book teaches C++ terribly. It's oversimplified, inaccurate, superficial, and doesn't provide nearly enough practice. If you want to learn SFML, then pick SFML Essentials or SFML Game Development. Yes, those books are also flawed, but at least they focused entirely on SFML, and there's way more actual library usage in them. And if you want to learn how to build decent architecture with SFML, then read SFML Blueprints or SFML Game Development, because the architecture there is significantly better than what we have here. Although again, those books also have a lot of problems. And I explained that in my previous reviews. So what does this book actually offer compared to the previous 4 SFML books? Honestly, nothing. The only real advantages are the code font is actually readable. The SFML installation guide is probably the best out of all the books, and the author constantly shows exactly where new code should be added inside Visual Studio. Because of that, rewriting code from this book is very easy. But overall, the explanations are garbage. The architecture are garbage. The games are garbage. But you know what? If you're a complete beginner who has never touched SFML before and you pick up this book, you'll probably find it pretty easy to follow, and maybe you'll even enjoy reading it. And if your own architecture is somehow even worse than the architecture in this book, then honestly, you'll probably improve a little after reading it, mostly thanks to the final project. So what's the author's biggest mistake? The problem is that he tried to write a book that teaches everything in a very short amount of time. The whole book feels like a marathon through 4 different games where while you're running, Someone quickly throws explanations at you about whatever you happen to encounter along the way. After that experience, you might say, wow, that was exciting, or that was memorable. But this is supposed to be technical literature. First and foremost, not an action movie. And because of that, this book is trash. And with that, my journey through SFML books is finally over. Honestly, it was rough. I read 5 different books, and there are reviews for all of them on my channel. Every single one of them was bad in different ways, some worse than others. In the future, I'm planning to make my own modern SFML course. First, I want to properly explain how all the tools in the library work. Then I want to show how to build interesting architectures for different game genres using SFML. And after that, I'd like to show 3 actual projects from my portfolio that use SFML. When will that happen? I honestly don't know. Life's been pretty difficult for me lately, and I just don't have much time left for recording lessons like that. But for now, I'm moving on to other areas. Maybe I'll start learning Unreal Engine or Unity. Maybe I'll find 1 or 2 more C++ books and continue searching for actually good modern programming books. We'll see. Anyway, thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed the review, feel free to leave a like, write a comment, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, become a channel member to get access to practical videos, or support me through the donation link in the description. All of that helps grow the channel and motivates me keep making videos for you guys. See you in the next videos. Bye everyone.